Hello everyone, and welcome to this Diablo 3 dungeon guide for the Crusader Roland's Legacy set. We'll be going over how to set up your character, and I'll also explain how to complete both primary dungeon objectives. Keep watching until the end to see a full playthrough of the entire set dungeon with additional tips. To get started, let's first take a look at the set bonuses so we'll know how to gear out our character. This set revolves heavily around the sweep attack skill, which is required for completing one of the primary dungeon objectives. Sweep attack receives a large damage buff, and each cast of sweep attack grants additional attack speed, toughness, and some cooldown reduction on select skills. The set is quite straightforward with no difficult mechanics to master. All you need to do is cast sweep attack to receive the benefits, which allows you to focus on the dungeon objectives. But you will need to put some emphasis on ensuring you cast sweep attack often enough to maintain the 5 stacks of the 6-piece set bonus toughness buff. Otherwise, you can easily die to the large groups of monsters in the dungeon if you don't have a lot of inherent toughness. Therefore, considering this, toughness and cooldown reduction are the main priorities for the gearing and skills setup. In this setup, here are the recommended items. Cooldown reduction is an emphasis, with Leoric's Crown, Vigilante Belt, Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac, and Ingium in the Kanai's Cube weapon slot. This will allow you to cast your abilities more often, like Akarat's Champion and Laws of Hope for toughness, Steed Charge for increased mobility, and Condemn for grouping up enemies. If you don't have enough cooldown reduction, it may be difficult to reach new monsters quickly, making it difficult to make progress toward the second primary dungeon objective, which requires you to spend 300 Wrath within 10 seconds. You might need to tone down your damage output if you kill enemies too quickly and don't have any monsters to hit to regenerate Wrath resource with your / primary attack skill. With enough cooldown reduction, you can just speed ahead with Steed Charge to constantly reach new enemies to hit. The 3 legendary gems all have a defensive focus. In general, you shouldn't need extra damage output, especially if you have Golden Flints and Denial equipped. Illusory Boots are a major quality of life improvement when grouping up enemies. You'll be able to run through monsters, making it easier to get into the middle of a large pack, or just stay on the move to avoid enemy hits. When assigning Paragon points, focus on increasing your toughness and cooldown reduction. And here are the skills. Sweep attack is mandatory for the dungeon, and is your main damage dealing skill. Condemn with the Vacuum Rune makes it much easier to group up monsters in a tight pack for completing the first primary dungeon objective. The Steed Charge skill provides some much needed mobility in this large sprawling dungeon, and can also be used to get you out of tight spots if you get trapped and don't have the Illusory Boots equipped. Most other skill selections provide increases to toughness to allow you to take hits while grouping up enemies. Now let's go over the dungeon objectives. The first primary dungeon objective is to hit 12 different enemies with a single sweep attack 7 times. This objective requires you to group enemies in tight packs before simply casting sweep attack on them. There are many opportunities throughout the dungeon to complete this objective. As mentioned previously, your main focus will be to ensure you have 5 stacks of the Roland's Legacy buff active before attempting to group monsters up, to ensure you have enough toughness to survive. The second primary dungeon objective is to spend 300 Wrath in 10 seconds 5 times. Sweep attack is your main Wrath resource spender, so all you need to do is spam cast sweep attack multiple times to empty your Wrath, then regenerate some of it with your primary / attack skill as needed, and then cast sweep attack again until you spend 300 Wrath. When you spend Wrath, a counter will show how much you've recently spent, so keep an eye on this to monitor your progress. To make it easier to complete both of these dungeon objectives, the following approach and cast sequence is recommended. First, make sure you have 5 stacks of the Roland's Legacy buff active. Try to cast sweep attack on single enemies to build up stacks and to refresh its duration timer just before you perform a grouping attempt. Then run into a larger pack of monsters, using Steed Charge if necessary to get toward the center of the group. Then hit Akarat's Champion if it's available, and Laws of Hope for their toughness buffs. Next, hit Condemn to suck monsters in towards you. Then, while you wait for the group to form up, start attacking with Slash to get extra toughness and to top off your Wrath resource. Once it looks like you have 12 or more monsters, hit them with sweep attack, and kill them off before they have a chance to hit you too many times. This will grant you progress toward the first dungeon objective. Next, glance at the counter tracking how much Wrath you've spent. If there are enough enemies left over in the area, particularly if there are any nearby elite monsters, then continue casting sweep attack to try to hit 300 total Wrath spent. Use the Slash skill to regenerate Wrath resource as needed. After all that, then continue to cast sweep attack to clear the area of any residual enemies, and get ready to move on to the next area. As you're traveling to the next pack, look for single monsters to hit with sweep attack to maintain the 5 stacks of the set toughness buff. Next, let's take a look at the dungeon map. This dungeon has a large sprawling layout. I've broken the map up into 4 different segments to cover all of it. Each segment has 3 or 4 main areas to look to attempt a sweep attack pull to make progress toward the first primary dungeon objective. Though you can find groupings of 12 plus enemies just about anywhere in the dungeon, These highlighted areas are generally larger, open spaces with room to run around and group up monsters. Don't expect to get many 12 plus enemy groupings in the more narrow interconnecting hallways. A good approach is to use Steed Charge to forge ahead to each subsequent highlighted zone shown here. Where different segments pass through the same rooms, you'll want to try to stick close to the walls on your first pass through the area to avoid potentially cross-contaminated monsters unnecessarily. It can be easy to pull too many monsters, much more than 12, in a single group, potentially robbing you of other potentially successful grouping attempts. So now that you have the setup and you know how to approach the dungeon, let's head to it. Go to Act 2, then to the road to Alcarnus waypoint. From there, simply head southwest and follow the nearby road. The dungeon entrance is a short run to the road's dead end. And next we'll look at the playthrough. For this run, I went with pretty barebones gear to demonstrate techniques. I had to equip the Golden Flint's legendary weapon to have enough damage output to complete the dungeon. Any additional items or stats that you get, consistent with the recommendations earlier, will give you a much easier time completing the dungeon. Once inside the dungeon, do not rush into a cluster of enemies to group them up unless you have a lot of inherent toughness. First, find the initial few monsters you come across and cast Sweep Attack until you have 5 stacks of the Roland's Legacy buff. Then cast Condemn to group up an enemy pack and hit them with Sweep Attack. Then head to the next area. Try to hit single enemies where possible when traveling between groups to maintain your Roland's Legacy toughness buff. Here, while trying to form another large group, we let our toughness buff drop, so we had to retreat back out and cast Sweep Attack a few times to rebuild the stacks. If this happens, just clear out the monsters and move to the next group. Here's another large group, and our toughness buff is about to drop off again. If you're quick enough, you can hit Condemn to suck some monsters in and hit them with Sweep Attack before the buff drops. Make sure you clear out these dead end areas. You don't want to have to run back through the dungeon looking for stragglers. As you move to the next area, hit single enemies with Sweep Attack to rebuild your buff stacks. You can group up enemies in these smaller areas, but if there isn't a massive concentration of them, just kill them off and move on. When you do see a large group, go through your cast sequence. Akarat's Champion and Laws of Hope for toughness, then Condemn to suck monsters in towards you, then attack with Slash while you wait for them to group up on you, then just cast Sweep Attack repeatedly while you clear out the area. You'll pass back through this area in a later segment, so try to hug this left side wall for now to avoid pulling monsters unnecessarily. Try to keep an eye on your minimap for any skulls that might be following you, and go ahead and kill them off so they don't get left behind. Here's another group. Suck them in, Sweep Attack, and clear out the rest. And another group. We had to attack a little prematurely because our buff stacks were about to drop, and we didn't hit 12 enemies with a single attack. If this happens to you, don't stress out about it. There are plenty of opportunities throughout the dungeon for grouping attempts. Here's a very large room that will usually contain plenty of monsters for a grouping attempt. There was such a high concentration there that we were able to get 2 different groups of 12. And the first primary dungeon objective is complete, and we still have a lot of dungeon left to go. Now we can put a larger focus on spending Wrath within 10 seconds. Anytime you have a lot of enemies available, keep an eye on the Wrath counter at the bottom of the screen. Just keep spamming Sweep Attack and try to get the counter to 300. If you're low on Wrath resource, attack with Slash a few times to regenerate some of it. Don't try to refill it completely. Just get a little bit of Wrath and cast a few more Sweep Attacks to get to the 300 mark. And now, both primary dungeon objectives are completed, and we still have a lot of dungeon left to go. Now we can just focus on killing off the remaining enemies. You don't need to worry about grouping enemies up any longer. You can just repeatedly cast Sweep Attack as you approach monsters, killing them off as you see them. Here's another room that we'll pass back through later. Try to stick to the left side wall and go north for now. Make sure to keep an eye out for any monsters following you. If you haven't completed the grouping objective yet, this stretch is pretty narrow, so you'll usually just kill monsters off through here. This room is a little more open, and we probably could have gotten another grouping there if needed. And here's another spot where another grouping could have been formed. And then as we head back into the larger area we passed by before, you'll find a couple more spots for grouping attempts. With enough toughness on items and legendary gems, you will be able to take many more hits without dying quickly, and the Roland's Legacy buff will not be as critical, giving you a much easier time grouping up enemies. Now we're just finishing out uncovering the minimap and clearing out the residual monsters. And we're done. Good luck trying to finish this one. If you enjoyed the guide and would like to see more content, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching.